Hello, good evening. I'm just going to join Deborah, who offered you our hellos from Associated Black Charities in the chat in the beginning, and say a verbal welcome to everybody in our audience. But let me turn, and he told us not to keep calling him Dr. Alex, but to do it Alex in terms of you. So it's fabulous bio in terms of this young man. And I am certainly excited to start this year's Speaker Series, Equity Series off with a young African American man, very focused on changing these outcomes, economic outcomes for Black workers in the United States. But first, Dr. Alice, before I bring you on, I do have to give a little shout out to our connection in terms of, I often talk about how great the ABC team is, and we actually got connected to you from one of our team members, Bernard Sims, who manages our volunteer career mentoring program, and all the team is always tracking data, tracking articles and information, and he connected with you and said, this will be a great speaker. And we all agreed. And then only to learn that at one point you had been at the Annie E. Casey Foundation right down the street in Baltimore, although you're now at the Joint Center for Political Studies, which is in DC, but you're based in Atlanta. So thank you for joining us from Atlanta. And again, welcome this evening, Dr. Alex. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you so much, and I hope you're having a wonderful evening. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, I want to jump right in. And one of the things I said to you when we had a chance to talk before is I was clear when we first had our first conversation, even from the materials that you've written, the research, about your own kind of personal passion about this work. Everybody knows in Baltimore how passionate I am about this in terms of it really is critical for us as a city, as a state, to pay attention to this in Baltimore, but it's important across the country. And I could very clearly hear your passion. And I'm excited about your ability to bring that passion to the center. And so if you could share more about you, a little bit more about your passion about it and why this is all important to you.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to college for me, which is not too far in the past. When I was growing up, from Mobile, Alabama, originally, born and raised on the Gulf Coast of the country, way in the deep South. And I grew up in a rather sheltered environment in terms of I wasn't fully aware of the challenges, the outsized challenges that Black Americans faced economically, socially, politically, et cetera, because I grew up in a world where those things are not explicitly taught to you in school in particular. So whenever I was able to get into college, I became a little bit more politically minded, I guess you could say. I kind of learned about what were some of the most pressing social issues affecting people of color in general through courses in, Black studies, African American history, started to really learn about all that stuff. I mean, I had to learn and be tested on Alabama history in my K through 12 education, but I was never truly taught and tested on the history of being Black in this country. And then it really culminated, unfortunately, in the events following the murder of Trayvon Martin. And which everybody, I think, in their life has like that one moment where they become kind of politicized or radicalized and become, their consciousness is kind of woken up. That was the moment for me. And then I began organizing for racial justice, immediately after that in college. So my experience started there really with this more sharp and explicit focus on, wanting to do work in service of Black communities. Later on, I decided to focus on a career in public policy because I realized that given all of the challenges, the systemic barriers, that we need to change laws in this country. And I went that way, thought I could do it through multiple routes, one being in philanthropy, which put me in the seat of a workforce development funder. In Atlanta, as some may know, the Casey Foundation has a place-based site in Atlanta. And in that work, learned about some of the day-to-day challenges that people experience trying to find good jobs, in particular Black folks, because Atlanta is disproportionately serving Black folks through its workforce systems. So in that experience, I became even more intimately familiar with some of the structural challenges facing our communities and decided, I want a more active role in this outside of philanthropy. And that's when I switched gears and transitioned into policy and advocacy research, where I can have conversations with lawmakers and be more influential as a lobbyist, as a subject matter expert and more. And that's what I'm thrilled to do here at the Joint Center, where I'm at America's Black think tank, where I get to unapologetically focus on advancing economic justice for Black folks in this country. So, I mean, I feel like it was not a straight and narrow path, but it was a pretty good path to get me here. And I've just would say I'm inspired by my work in philanthropy, working on the ground, working with my family members who have struggled to find good jobs, to earn good money, to get into college and otherwise, you know, folks affected by the mass incarceration system. Those experiences shaped who I am today and are why I'm, you know, committed and passionate about doing this work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and your why that you're passionate about this work. If you could share also more about your particular work at the Joint Center. Joint Center, for those that don't know, I mean, I've known about the Joint Center for many, many years. And I love your statement about being at the Joint Center so you could unapologetically focus on Black issues in terms of, and that's what they're known for, and not just focusing, but using data to drive public policy. And we're going to get more into that conversation with you. We know here in Baltimore how important data is to drive this conversation versus having people think, oh, this is just a verbal conversation. This is esoterical. No, this is really factual, and important data is to making sure people understand those facts. But if you could share a little bit more about Joint Center and what you're doing there.
Yeah, well, for those who don't know, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and who I'll just refer to as the Joint Center, because it is a mouthful, is an institution. It's a Black institution in this country, and it's been around for over 50 years, founded in 1970, and has since then focused on advancing political and social and economic priorities that would benefit Black Americans. You know, so we have a long history of working closely with lawmakers, particularly in DC, to inform and advise and educate them on crafting legislative proposals and administrative solutions that would, you know, improve the lives of Black folks. Some of our most well-known work at the Joint Center is our work in terms of political studies, making sure that we have more Black representation in leadership positions across Congress, as well as within the White House. You know, so we have a large portfolio of work focused on staff diversity, because the people that are, you know, advising our legislators need to look like Black folk, like they need to reflect the communities that they serve. So that's one strand of our work. I focus on workforce policy. Workforce policy, excuse me, encompasses a few different, you know, issues. But the main two buckets that we focus on are removing barriers to post-secondary education and training, ranging from short-term training, your typical workforce development programs, all the way through access to four-year degrees at your colleges and universities. So that's some of the barriers there that we are trying to tackle include like affordability issues, you know, ensuring that there are wraparound supports for Black workers who go to short-term training. That we're addressing the opportunity costs of pursuing training, that those training programs lead to good jobs, because not everyone who leaves a program is going to end up in a good job, which is not how the program should work. So the other bucket of our work is about making all jobs good jobs. So we're heavily invested and involved in, you know, ensuring that job quality is an element of our labor policy. We want to make sure that it, you know, if Black folks are working in fast food restaurants, that they're being paid a living wage, that they're offered, you know, work supports like employer-sponsored health coverage, et cetera. We want to make sure that, you know, if you're working for one of the largest employers in the country, that you're not being paid so low that you have to actually turn to food assistance or cash assistance in order to make ends meet. We also want to guarantee workers, Black workers, don't have to deal with harassment and racial discrimination in the workplace. So there's a portfolio of work focused specifically on that. If I had to name kind of the how we do this, I'd break it down into three different ways. So one is through our research. So as Diane mentioned, we are researchers, we are data analysts, policy analysts, We are looking at the numbers day in and day out, examining what policy proposals will mean in terms of their impact on Black communities, examining trends that are often not discussed in the typical news cycle affecting Black folks. So, you know, we may hear things about the promising labor market, you know, and how well it's doing, but you often don't hear it disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So we stand in that gap and make sure that, you know, we're talking about what these numbers mean for Black folks. So the research piece is a big one. The second piece is through our actual, you know, policy influence, you know, having conversations with legislators. We don't want to produce research just so that it lives on a bookshelf. We want to make sure that folks see it as a useful resource, a practical guide for their actual lawmaking. We need our legislators to be informed and use and reference data that will eventually lead to promising proposals and eventually good laws that will positively benefit Black communities. And then the third strand is like just our convening power. Like we see our role as a convener. We bring together lawmakers, advocates, you know, grassroots organizers, other research think tanks, all with the goal of advancing progressive policy for Black communities. We learn from each other. We think of each other you know, across sectors. How can we mutually resource each other to meet that big main goal of improving the lives of Black folks? So our convening capacity is, you know, and role is extremely important as well. So those are the three like activities, I guess you could say, that get us to improving workforce policy here at the Joint Center.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move on to some other questions, but as I do, I want to say to our audience that part of framing this discussion this evening, we hope that our audience will have questions for you, Alex. So is the importance of data. And it's not just the importance of data in terms of driving the outcome in terms of public policy, but one of the questions I asked Alex to be prepared to answer for us this evening as we get towards the end is, what does this mean that what you can do as an audience? What is it you can do to make a difference to using data to becoming a part of the action agenda to change the wealth outcome for Black workers? This is not a passive conversation, guys. It's not a passive world we're in right now to change those economic outcomes for Black workers. This is really about action. And in many cases, we often don't recognize we have power. We absolutely have power. It's just how do we use it and how do we use data? How do we use other tools to actually invest our power in making a difference for Black people? But I want to go to another part of what you do at Joint Center, because as you describe the three pieces, one of those pieces I know is also keeping your finger on the pulse of what's going on out there in the Black community. And so you had an opportunity to share with me that you actually get input from Black people, Black Americans, in terms of surveys. So can you share more about that and what you learned from keeping your finger on the pulse of talking directly to Black Americans?
Yeah. So, you know, there are a couple of ways that we do this. So, you know, when we think about the sources of data, the most well-known data sources are administrative data sets that are produced by like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Department of Labor. Like those are kind of the most useful, regular components, data resources that we can use to see what's happening or what's the status of Black folks in the economy. You know, so for example, every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases Jobs Day numbers, the employment situation report. And there is a lot of news attention given to this report because it's one of the most referenced indicators of economic health in the country. So it tells you how many jobs have been added, you know, over the last month. It tells you what the unemployment rate is currently. And it's one that's referenced from lawmakers, from the president himself, as being kind of an indicator of progress. The number of jobs that we've been able to create during an administration comes from that particular report. Well, if you kind of scroll way down into the report and use a magnifying glass or you zoom in, you know, with the computer, you'll see some statistics specifically around Black workers. So we actually export those statistics and make make that the headline for the work that we do, and say, actually, yeah, we may have created, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the unemployment rate overall may have gone down. It's about 3% right now. But by our calculation, and we're really by what you reported, Black workers, or the unemployment rate for Black folks, is twice what it is for the general population. And we need to think about crafting solutions around that. So we look at that as our indicator. The health in the labor market of Black workers is our priority. That's one way, through those administrative kind of data sets.
Can I just
and
say,
that's just one example.
Alex, can I just say one thing, stop you there, and as you go to the next one, I just want to make the point here for our audience. This is why it's really, really critical, important to support, to read, to reach out to Black organizations about the data and about what they know and can share about Black Americans, because that information you talked way, way down in terms of fine print, that doesn't make it on the headlines anywhere. And so as we get the headline from the Daily News, and we get the headline from the news, it's not going to share that information in terms of the health. And we know that we are often end at the bottom, but that data is important in terms of the effort to push harder, to go past kind of the public top of the line information that puts everybody in that together, that doesn't say how badly we're hurting. And so it really is critical to look for that data from Black organizations that will give you the truth in terms of the facts, not just an opinion, but he's talking about giving you data that says this is where we are in terms of the employment space. Thank you, Alex. Go for it. I apologize for the interruption. I wanted to make that plug again.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the purpose of this, and that's why I'm here. I want to preach that as well, that we have to, if nothing else, the Joint Center can teach others how to ask the right questions, because that is what's important right now, because a lot of folks are getting off the hook because people aren't asking the right questions. Another source of data that we have looked at recently is surveys. We conduct some surveys here at the Joint Center. We kind of do this regularly, and we'll be doing it increasingly so, over the next several years, as we kind of boost and build our internal capacity to do survey work. But recently we conducted a survey with Black Americans leading up to the President's State of the Union address. Again, we wanted to get a pulse of how Black Americans felt about the state of the economy, and really touch on bread and butter issues that are affecting all Americans, but maybe affecting Black Americans more. And, some of the results of that were really revealing to us, in light of the president preparing to give a speech that would talk about how much economic progress has been made over the last year of his term, and how much economic recovery we may have experienced. Black Americans, by observing or analyzing the poll results that we released, would disagree with that progress, right? So, for example, 28%, almost 1 in 3 Black Americans argued in our poll that their economic situation, their financial situation, has gotten worse over the last year. That's a lot, that's disproportionately high. There's only, I think that it warrants us questioning, how healthy the economy is and who this recovery is affecting. But I mean, we wouldn't get that insight unless we really, took the time to poll and survey Black Americans in the nature that we did. I'm glad that we did, because now we have a baseline to work from. There are other things that we do with this information in terms of getting a pulse check, which is figuring out what the priorities of Black Americans are. So for instance, some of the priorities that are high on the list for Black Americans include addressing, public health, prioritizing investments in public health, prioritizing investments in historically Black colleges and universities, ensuring that they are well resourced and funded to participate in educating folks to return back to work. Priorities also include investments in stimulus, making sure that people have a strong safety net, whether it be through the child tax credit or through expanded unemployment insurance and otherwise, to make sure that they don't fall deeper into poverty as a result of being out of work. So that's another reason why, being able to take a pulse check on what the priorities of Black Americans are through the survey work is incredibly important to our work at the Joint Center. And I want to say one last thing on this, and because I know I'm saying a lot, but
Oh, please.
Another component that we do, but isn't publicized as often, is actually like qualitatively talking to Black communities, to Black leaders, hosting focus groups in which we bring workers. I myself and my colleagues on our workforce policy team convene working folk to come to the table and share what their experiences have been with training programs, with accessing key resources as low-wage workers or workers paid low wages, excuse me. And we compensate those individuals for their time, for participating, you know, like, so the data, the statistics are all important and probably easier to digest for a lot of the media and lawmakers, but it would be nothing without the more qualitative input, community-driven input that we try to gather with working folks themselves. So I
From the
wanted to make
real
sure that
folks.
I had that.
Thank you. From the real folks that are impacted. Important
Yep.
for their voice to be a part of this conversation. Critical. I want to take a question that's in the chat from somebody in the audience only because it's relevant here in terms of asking the question if you identify data specific to industry and down to neighborhoods, because this information would be good for job development grants. I can give a Baltimore perspective, but if you want to share, please do.
So I will say that we don't drill down to the neighborhood level. The Joint Center is pretty, I should say, big picture focused. We look at a lot of trends at the federal level. We also, you know, do look a little bit closely at the state level, understanding that the dynamics of in labor market statistics vary widely at the state level. But at this time, we haven't drilled down to like the local or the neighborhood level yet. But it is worth, you know, us keeping in mind as we think about what we need to build capacity around as an organization as we grow our team. We're also a growing team. That's something else I should, you know, be clear about here. We're really growing our capacity to do more and support other Black organizations and think tanks and advocates with our research.
This is part of why you were brought there, right? To help grow that team.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I was very fortunate that, you know, I was brought on to grow this team and expand our focus and scale our potential to be a better partner to organizations working in service of Black communities. The other part to your question around specific industry analysis, yes, we do observe some data regarding industry representation of Black workers. So for instance, we're concerned with the overrepresentation of Black workers in industries that do typically pay low wages, that are not well known for job quality. And then we make recommendations based off of that for programs. So for training programs, for instance, on which industries they should focus on in order to better guarantee or promote economic mobility for training participants. So for example, one of the, you know, industries that are where Black workers are underrepresented, which tend to be more like white collar occupations, like office type jobs, those that are more cushy and do offer a little bit higher pay and more. We are, you know, recommending that training participants focus on sector strategies into those occupations where Black workers are underrepresented, so that there can be a stronger link to career paths that are linked to economic mobility as well. So we do a little bit of that. But again, it is mostly focused on federal data.
I will share locally where some of the data is, but I also want to raise another question from one of our audience participants. And it's about the survey in terms of, so how is the survey conducted? This particular person is that they've never been outreach for a survey ever in terms of that. So often some groups use companies that actually conduct the survey, and they have a whole kind of technology of determining how they reach out to people. I don't know that if you would share that in terms of that. It really is random in some ways, and you could live your whole life and never get picked for a survey.
Yeah, look, I've never been picked to respond to the census, with the exception of the decennial last year or in 2020. I've always wanted to be a part of the American Community Survey. I've never gotten that call yet, and I'm looking forward to that day. It is definitely not likely that everybody will be surveyed. in general, and I'm not talking specifically about our survey, but what most survey shops do, Diane, what you described, is focus on a sample of folks, right? So a sample is a small group that is representative of a larger population, a larger universe of the population. And we work with a third-party company that develops the methodology. We advise on it. Develops the weighting that needs to be applied to the sample so that it is representative of the total population, Black population. And then they go on and they make, phone calls and send emails, and some survey shops even do direct mail in order to get respondents. So the total sample is around, like, for this particular survey, was around like 500 to 600 folks, which shows you how small a sample can be, but it is representative of the whole population, thanks to some of the weighting techniques that these organizations or these companies are able to apply to their survey work.
So thank you for sharing that. I think it's important information for all of us to know how that is done. The other thing I want to share in terms of local data, ABC actually has a report that's now dated though, but I'm not sure, and Deborah can post a linkage to it, in terms of where African Americans are employed in what sectors from Baltimore City. And so we wanted to see that data. It's probably now dated 4 years, and found out like 66% of African American workers in Baltimore are employed in 4 sectors, and then low wage jobs in those 4 sectors. And those sectors have high wage job opportunities. And so that's part of our nut to crack in terms of changing that, because that really is, we believe, around systemic racism, in terms of, it's not just, you will have some jobs, and we know this factually in this country, that say you need a college degree, but you often can redo that job in terms of didactically develop a training for a person to go in that job. Baltimore has a number of great examples, and I'm pleased to share, since I was involved with it years ago, in terms of the Biotech Institute is taking someone with a high school diploma and literally training them in a lab to go become clean room laboratory technicians. And they actually people have been able to track those wages over the last 20 years of existence to show how well people are able to make off. But you got to have a willing employer who's willing to do that. And so part of that is, how do we change that so that those opportunities become available? But that's a set of data. Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance has another set of data. Actually, that's probably a good source. I don't know that, to the audience members asking, it goes down to the employment piece. But I would also say go to the state website in terms of the Maryland Department of Labor. And I will say go there, but I don't think Alex, data is broken down by race. And I say go there because if it's not broken down by race, that's a conversation you may want to have with your legislators, or you may want to reach out to government. We're not a lobbying nonprofit, so I certainly can't urge you to do that, but I would just say data is data. And if it's not available, you would think your state website on labor would show you where Black and brown people are working and what sectors. And if it's not showing you that, your question has to be, why not? And we can talk about that, because there are data sets that actually, as you talk at the national level, what we understood is that data hadn't dropped down completely to the state level. But that's critical. That's why that's so important, this conversation we're having about data in terms of making it part of advocacy.
I will 100%, plus all of that. I think, one of the, I'm in Georgia, and we're not too different from Maryland in terms of, access issues. And I think that one of the problems with data, so they have the data, they collect, at the individual level, your demographic information, and they're able to track all of that information over time using records. They mask your individual level data using records or codes. The point, though, is that states and local areas, they have access to that information. They don't report it. Even if they reported it at an aggregate level that still protected the individual privacy of folks, that would make a monumental difference. But they're not doing that. In order to access a lot of these indicators, a lot of this data, you have to be You have to have a master's in stats or a PhD in order to even interpret some of this information. And everyday folks, I mean, imagine the power of, everybody knowing what the status of their economic, what their economic situation, their community is. We can't even, it's hard to imagine, right? Because not everybody has access to those resources, to the skills to be able to actually draw down those numbers, drill down on those numbers. And I do think, I also, am cautious about, as a Joint Center, as a C3, organization here as well, but, we actively educate lawmakers. And I do think this is an education opportunity for them to say, well, like, we need the state agency of labor or economic development or whichever to actually give us monthly reports on how Black people are doing in employment at the state level.
Yeah.
Now at the national level, you'll get that information but at the state level, you're not going to get it every month.
Yeah.
And we need more regular reporting of this information. If they say, well, the sample sizes are too small, there's not enough, you just change the power, or you actually want to say that we want to know just descriptively how Black folks are doing on a monthly basis. And that's an advocacy opportunity that I think all of us could take up through op-eds, right? Through writing in our local media, through running blogs, or even just simply tweeting about it on Twitter, because pretty much all legislators have Twitter at this point.
Good point.
So yeah, I'm just building on what you were saying there, and that we need better transparency, better access. We've, for those who are familiar with the workforce system, we've been fighting for the reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act to include a change in the statute to require states and local workforce boards to regularly report their outcomes by race and ethnicity, which they currently do not do. It all just goes up to the national level, and you just kind of wait and see, what comes out of that. And then the data is not reliable in many cases. So there's a legislative opportunity there.
It's about education. I mean, that's your point. We're not, but it's certainly important to educate our legislators, whether it's local, state, in terms of, although your city council doesn't control, they can be a part of the voice. It says to the state government that that's important information. We're in election season, say to candidates, we want that data in terms of being available. It'll help all of us in terms of transparency to help bring about that different vision, that different goal that everybody says they want. They want African Americans to have economic equity. Okay, so let's figure out how you help us to make sure the data becomes available so we can all keep on track of it and measure it. But you began to talk about that data from the workforce in terms of a national perspective. And you just recently released a report, I believe, that actually goes a little bit deeper into the data around the public training programs or funded by public dollars. Can you share more details about what you learned?
Yeah, so in March, we released a report improving training programs, evaluations to improve the future of work for Black folks. And I'm tearing up that title because that is not it, but that's the subject of the report. It is an examination of 80 different program evaluations of workforce development training programs or career pathways programs, ranging from apprenticeships in IT, construction, hospitality, healthcare, all the way through community college programs. So mostly focused on short-term training programs. Out of the 80 programs, only 4 reported their outcomes by race and ethnicity, positive outcomes by race and ethnicity. Just a few more out of 80. So the main finding is that an overwhelming majority of program evaluations are not disaggregating the outcomes by race and ethnicity.
Wow.
And, that has pretty jarring implications in terms of program design, especially whenever the folks coming through the programs are disproportionately people of color. And we're not creating or designing programs or making improvements that are racially just, that are culturally competent, and more. So that was a pretty, concerning finding for us. We obviously are taking that and going to lawmakers and saying we must require that evaluators who get public contracts to evaluate these programs, taxpayer dollar contracts, right, need to evaluate their outcomes by race and ethnicity. Otherwise, we may be reproducing poor outcomes for communities of color, and that in itself makes the workforce system ineffective, right? It's also, there are a lot of programs that claim to be doing equity because they recruit or enroll higher shares of people of color, higher shares of Black and Latinx job seekers. That's fine. That just means your participants are more diverse. It doesn't mean that the outcomes are better for those participants. And we need mechanisms in place in how we measure and evaluate these programs to ensure that we are looking at outcomes and like closing earnings disparities between completers of color and white completers and otherwise. So that's what the recent report was on. And now we're currently working on getting some recommendations into law to ensure that programs are doing right by job seekers and evaluating for constant improvement. Like, it's not to demonize programs, but it's to support them in their constant and continuous improvement so that they can better serve Black communities and actually get to some advancing economic mobility. I should say too, we don't want to, I understand the challenges of data collection for providers. Again, I was a funder of workforce development. I actually was on the side of requiring grantees to submit, interim and final reports on the number of people placed into employment and their earnings. And the challenges that I observed as a funder were that providers don't always have the capacity. They don't have the front end, CRM to do intake and include the question of what is your race on the form. So it has to be it can't be an unfunded mandate on providers. We need the government and philanthropy and the private sector employers to all invest in the capacity of these providers so that they can actually track this information by race and ethnicity.
Okay, can I ask you to say that again? So there's a current conversation in Baltimore right now about that very issue in terms of making sure providers, and there's small providers that are Black-led groups that don't have that capacity, but have real clear sense of what they're doing in terms of making the difference in terms of that. But what are we doing to make sure they can be a part of that table? What are we doing to make sure that even providers that are out there are part of the data conversation as government is laying out what should be done? We really have to begin to integrate this, just as we talk about making sure that the workers' voice is included. Many of our workforce providers are Black-led and are very focused about what they know the data should be and what the data challenges are. They need to be at the table too, as a part of changing the outcomes or changing the way to get the information out there.
Yeah, well, I think that there are institutional folks who can provide technical assistance to providers that may need to learn, how to effectively collect the right information on intake forms and coaching. Coaches need to know or have the capacity to be able to measure outcomes in a certain way. I'd be really interested in, strengthening the role of anchor institutions in our cities to support low Black-led, providers. In Baltimore, Johns Hopkins is right there. Although I know it's been a controversial institution, I think that it's right there. And you have other institutes of higher education where you have researchers, skilled researchers and data analysts and others that can support providers to collect this information. Look, the bottom line though is that data collection is expensive. It's not cheap. It's not as simple all the time as having an Excel spreadsheet. That's not going to work for everybody. An investment needs to be made in a Salesforce, which is extremely expensive. If you have even if you have the nonprofit rate. I think that that's where I want to see a lot of attention given to, is what it takes to actually invest in the front end collection and the ongoing measurement and tracking of outcomes. So it's money. It comes down to money. Yeah.
But somebody in the audience made the point that I absolutely want to share in terms of, we have Morgan and we have Coppin here in Baltimore.
That's right. Yeah.
Both HBCUs that can add value in this space. And philanthropy in terms of being clear that it can add value and supporting that to happen and saying that's important, and not just kind of the hammer over the head of, well, if you don't have it, you don't have it. And so to Winston and to Tiffany out there and to Jason, I won't call their last names. Okay, you got some ways to go after. How do we get those partners in terms of that and have those conversations even with our HBCU and others around getting that for our workforce providers? It's critical, and they often are on the front line in terms of, they often should be some of the voices we consult with about what is best in terms of for Black workers, in terms of making that difference, in terms of moving forward. But I wanted to say to you, Alex, and I actually apologize because I was all excited that I went, and I'm not very technically proficient, but I went, your study is called Improving Training Evaluation Data to Brighten the Future of Black Workers.
There we go.
Okay.
I was close.
I want, and if Deborah, if you can find it and put it in the chat for people on Joint Center's website, because I read it in terms of after we talked, and I think it's a great piece of information, again, about that data. I would love to see, as you continue to go forward in your data analysis, though, is also making sure that that support, the wraparound services that we have now proven are important in terms of moving forward, is that should be captured and should be something that's funded. I would go a step further on behalf of ABC to say, addressing structural racism and doing the whole issue of race, the training around that whole journey around removing those racialized barriers should be funded by government too, in terms of, we find that we are working with partners to do that, but struggle with finding funding, because when people begin to recognize that sitting in their policy and their practice, and they simply didn't realize it, it begins to make a difference for the outcome of those Black workers. We need to fund that as well. And so that's my plug on behalf of ABC, is getting that work funded by a federal government as well.
Well, I mean, on that note, the poll that I mentioned earlier that we administered early this year, a majority of Black Americans firmly believe that it's the federal government's responsibility to advance racial equity. Which makes sense given the federal government's role in erecting the barriers that we have long had to deal with to this day. So I agree with you on that, and would love to see greater investment in the wraparound supports, looking at the data, of course, but through the public workforce system, they're trying to deal with the provision of things like childcare. Deal with the provision of transportation assistance and other wraparound supports. One of my favorite examples of here in Atlanta is, forgot the name of it, but it's a short-term health insurance for job training participants offered through Kaiser, the health provider, healthcare provider, for nonprofit providers. Like stuff like that is, worth the investment if we want to see Black folks be successful in these programs. But it's not getting that investment. Investments have fallen substantially in public workforce systems over the last few decades. And right now we're, fighting tooth and nail to maintain increased investments in the public workforce system, because philanthropy can't do it alone. And they're the main ones funding our workforce system right now. Absolutely. And they can't keep, it's not sustainable. Nope. So especially when the need is outgrowing the investment. So yeah.
So Alex, I have a question though, from a public policy perspective, whether or not it makes sense, because philanthropy is in fact funding a lot of that. And in Baltimore, for example, there is a group organization, Baltimore's Promise, and partnered with the city's workforce investment in terms of Mayor's Office of Employment Development and other funders for this grads to career, and actually proved about providing both their wraparound services and simply what it says is graduating from high school in terms of to career, providing those supports, providing the hard training with working with providers in the area makes a difference and measurable. Why aren't we taking what happens, what a number of the workforce providers in the funded and showing they can show what works, and they can show the success, and they can show innovation. And whether or not we couldn't have a public policy in the workforce space, that when you have 2 years of that something of private funding showing that success, those get some extra points or something for government to pick up in terms of funding. If we had a better system for handing off success in terms of where the philanthropy has worked as an investor for the innovation, the innovation's proven to make a difference in terms of the outcomes, for government to pick up and then fund that. That would make so much more sense in terms of moving the needle in this country, particularly for Black workers. So I love your take on that.
Yeah, well, there are examples of like pay for performance programs, right, that are a public-private partnership between private investors and the government. There are some other examples of, ways or examples of programs that have received attention and for being a positive pilot, and showing promising outcomes, and then have been able to benefit from public investments so that they could scale.
Yes.
There's not enough though. And I do agree. I think that it could be more useful if we shone a light on what's working. The challenge is, the threat in that, I should say, is that historically those approaches can create winners and losers. You can essentially cream those programs that might be winning all the time. And those programs, and I'm not familiar with, Baltimore Promise, this may be a different scenario there, but in other spaces, the winners may always be the more well-resourced organizations, the white-led resource organizations. And while your local community-based organizations who don't have the infrastructure to support or demonstrate, more promising outcomes because of systemic disinvestment, are going to miss out on the resources to scale and the public policy, attention too. So I think that's the threat there. But I do see promise. Like, to me, when I worked in philanthropy and even transitioning into more of the public policy work, I've always, argued that philanthropy's role is to just help demonstrate, like fund bold ideas, new innovation, like seed, like proactive stuff. We don't have to recycle things that are proving not to be as effective, but let's see how we can capture what works using philanthropic dollars, and then make a case to actually make bold public investments in those programs and services based off of what philanthropy is funded. And there's not enough of that. Now, arguably, a lot of what happens is the programs or services, investments in those programs and services also need political will. And, the nature of workforce development, it's hard to get political will to invest in these programs and services because they kind of they're on the fringe of, traditional K-12 education, higher education, and otherwise. So I don't want to take it out of the political context, because that's often what stops us from passing policies that can bring promising programs to scale. But there's also the issue of us, not knowing what works because media is not reporting it. There aren't enough good storytellers out there telling the good story. Evaluators, are evaluating these programs and writing the reports, but it's left to think tanks like our own and many other groups to say, well, this is a good case study of what we should be applying to public policy. So, yeah.
I would add, I think you're absolutely right. The point, you're spot on the point around you could end up doing disinvestment. And so I would add to my comment about philanthropy in terms of innovation. And I would say you'd have to have some other elements to that. You'd have to have the element of, did this program, in fact, was it embedded with equity? I would say it would have to have other elements in terms of principles. Is it, in fact, partner with community-based organizations, things like that, that will assure you in terms of many ways that people, our community, and that disinvestment doesn't happen. I think if we build that into the best practice to say, we're looking for best practice that has all of this, It's not okay just to have the numbers. You got to do all of this in terms of, you've got to have embedded with equity in terms of inside of your organization, how you do your work. You got to be able to prove that. I think we have to ask those questions inside of public policy, even if we want to use that for innovation, and ask it of philanthropy, which will push that sector even further to make sure that's there. And so as I gave that example, that's an organization, because I'm on the board, although I'm coming off shortly, I do know we push very hard in the board around equity being embedded. And there's a community advisory board that's now in place. It took a long time, but it really does understand that voice, community voice, resident voice, youth voice are part of going to make the difference in the future. That is not, we can't do this from up here. That's not where it's happening. And so that's critical. But I do want to stop in terms of, because of time, to see if there are any questions from our audience. And as I looked and wait to see if our audience has any questions, I do want to ask you to elaborate a little bit further on a comment you just made about workforce. And I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Workforce as a political priority is on the fringe compared to early childhood or childcare, or that, is it because my belief, I'm checking my belief out, may not be fact, that because you're talking about an adult population, that often adult population is generally probably Black or brown in turn. Is that why that's on the fringe? Because we tend to, in our country, for investments, we want to invest early in terms of children, or we invest children in families, but it's tough to get our legislators to focus on adults as needing. And so we don't make the translation. Those same adults are often parents with children in terms of needing that economic mobility. Is that why they're on the fringe, or is there another reason?
Well, I think that might be part of it. It's certainly, and it's a domain of our birth to career pipeline or pathway, I guess, cradle to career, that old Casey speak, that is not recognized as a space that could help accelerate mobility to higher earnings and to long-term economic mobility, like a 4-year degree can, right? So it is not lifted up as kind of like a silver bullet solution, or and I think we see that with the lack of investment, or the declining investments in the short-term workforce training, workforce development system. The federal workforce system, primarily like the WIOA funded system, or excuse me, the programs and services funded by the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which is the system and governing structure that lifts up our local workforce development boards and organizations and the providers that we've been talking about today. So I think that's one part of it. The other part of it, my scholarship focuses on the ways that the federal workforce system is a reproduction of welfare to work. And if you're familiar with, the welfare system, and I use the term welfare as just because it's easily recognizable, but it's not one that I, am happy to use all the time. It prioritizes low-income people, particularly people who receive public assistance through food stamps, through TANF, cash assistance, and otherwise. And embedded in that is this notion of the welfare queen. Yeah. And because the stereotype, exactly. And because the stereotypes are embedded, like literally one of the goals in the law of WIOA is to reduce dependency on welfare. Like that's the objective number 2. Right. So it's built on this meritocratic idea of personal responsibility and pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And of course, if we're going to put people into that system, then we don't need to invest much into it. Right. We just need to rely on people to get the scraps that they get and pull themselves up by the bootstraps. As
though structural racism doesn't exist and make that impossible to even have any boots. But we only have a few minutes, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to share, how can our audience make a difference in terms of, we talked about that when we had our brief conversation. Tell us how we can make a difference in terms of this whole data conversation and changing the economic outcomes for Black workers.
Yeah, so my biggest piece of advice when it comes to getting the right data, when people are talking about, improvements that they make, whether it's politicians, it's lawmakers who are already in office, if it's your local representative from an economic development agency or a workforce agency or otherwise, and they're saying that they're doing all these great things, and we've added 1 million jobs, the number one question that I want folks to ask is for whom? Like that simple question, I find like that's what I tell people. That's what my mom thinks I do at work, because that's what I do. When it boils down to is when people say that we're doing great, we're doing well, I'm asking, well, who is doing well? We don't know. Do you know? Because we don't know. Have you looked at the data? Then that starts to add more questions. One question leads to another. And I feel like that's an easy way for us to expose what's available to us, what we don't know, and what we do know. So, asking people in power, like for whom, who is benefiting, is, one big piece of advice there. Secondly, get involved with various campaigns. I'm actually going to drop a link in the chat, if I may, about the Black Worker Bill of Rights. And this is a campaign that being advanced by the Black Worker Policy Coalition to get employers, policymakers, philanthropy to work together and advance like actual dignity in work through things like the right to organize in the workplace, the right to assert your rights, the right to equitable wages and have career advancement opportunities. These are things that either can happen through legislation or that employers can just go ahead and do themselves. And this coalition is working together to make these 10 rights, the 10 Black worker rights in the Black Worker Bill of Rights a reality. And we invite everybody to chime in and share these rights and talk to your decision makers about, and your employers about making these rights a reality for all Black workers. So
Alex, thank you so much. We probably could have continued to talk for another hour in terms of,
I know.
we're at our time, and it's always great in terms of to get somebody as knowledgeable, committed, and passionate to be here with us and to share your expertise and just kind of common sense in terms of with all of us. And so I urge our audience to follow up in terms of contacting you. I urge our audience to take the next step in terms of what they can do, we can do, and to urge our audience to join ABC in terms of the push. And there are other organizations here in Baltimore that are doing the same. And so again, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank Kenny Clash again in terms of for serving as our technical person in terms of that, very much so, from Digital Harbor, and to the ABC team that put this on in terms of Deborah Bess and Anika Edmonds in terms of thank you. But most of all, again, Alex, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I wish all of you well and safe. Thank you.
Thank you.